Chapter 1. Where the light first touched stone. Greece begins not with a city, a hero or a god, but with the land itself, rugged, ancient, and shaped by the slow breath of time. Its geography is not soft or easy. It is broken and beautiful, a land of jagged mountains, steep ridges, sunlit valleys, and shores kissed by the endless Aegean Sea. Greece is not a single landmass, but a scattered collection of peninsulas and islands, like shards of a greater whole strewn across the water. These natural divisions would become the quiet architects of culture. Isolation bred difference. Valleys nurtured villages that grew into cities. Each had its own rhythm, its own story, and its own gods. There was no single Greece. Not then. Only many Greek worlds, each echoing a distinct melody of life. The mountains were protected, but also separated. The sea connected, but could never unite. This balance of closeness and distance shaped the Greek spirit. It made room for independence, for rivalry, and for freedom. No king could rule them all. No city could claim them all. And in that space of difference, ideas bloomed. From the fields of Thessaly to the islands of the Cyclades, from the highlands of Epirus to the coast of Attica, the Greeks learned to live with the land, not against it. Their gods rose from caves, springs, and mountaintops. Their myths clung to rocks and rivers. They found the divine in nature and the sacred in separation. Long before the world knew their names, the Greeks were being carved by their land, shaped by cliffs and coastlines into a people destined for stories. The Minoan, mystery, long before the marble columns of Athens or the bronze spears of Sparta, there were the Minoans, a people who lived not in conquest, but in color. Their home was the island of Crete, a lush and fertile land floating between 3 continents. Here, in the heart of the Bronze Age, they built something different. Their cities had no walls. Their art was filled with joy. They painted flowing, dancers and dolphins leaping through waves. They raised grand palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, sprawling structures with winding halls and open courtyards, as if made for movement, light, and air. The Minoans were masters of the sea. Their ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, trading with Egypt, the Levant, and the Greek mainland. They brought tin, saffron, and stories. Their influence spread across the waves like perfume, leaving traces in every port they touched. But their writing, the mysterious script known as Linear A, remains undeciphered, locked in silence. Without words to explain them, we see them only in images. Women with curled hair and wide skirts, bulls charging beneath painted ceilings, priests raising hands in ritual. Their world feels half-dreamed, suspended between myth and memory. And then, just as mysteriously as they rose, the Minoans faded. Some say it was the eruption of Thera, a volcanic blast that shattered the island of Santorini and sent waves crashing upon Crete. Others believe it was invasion or slow decline. Whatever the cause, the palaces fell, the people scattered, the light dimmed, but their memory lived on, in tales of a labyrinth, a minotaur, a sea-born power lost beneath the waves. Perhaps this was Atlantis. Perhaps it was only a whisper. Either way, the Minoans vanished, but their echo remained, a soft, painted breath in the story of Greece, the Mycenaean kings. While Crete dreamed in color, the mainland carved its legacy in stone. On the high hills of Mycenae, warriors ruled from fortified palaces, their halls lined with gold and guarded by lions. These were the Mycenaeans, a people shaped by strength, war, and story. They built their homes atop ridges, protected by thick walls known as Cyclopean, so massive that later Greeks believed only giants could have moved the stones. Inside these walls, kings like Agamemnon held court. They traded far and wide, reaching Egypt and beyond. But unlike the Minoans, their art spoke of power, not peace. The Mycenaeans wrote in Linear B, a script deciphered to reveal lists, inventories, and prayers, the ordinary bones of a kingdom. But their true legacy lived in story, for it was their world that inspired the epics of Homer. The Trojan War, with its wooden horse and 10-year siege, rose from Mycenaean roots. Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, all shadows born from this Bronze Age twilight. Archaeologists have found masks of gold, blades of bronze, and jars still holding oil scented with herbs from long ago. Each discovery adds detail to the myth. Each ruin whispers a name. They were builders, fighters, and storytellers. Their ships sailed across the Aegean. Their spears clashed with Troy. Their voices filled the darkened halls with chants of glory. They believed in honor, in vengeance, in fate. And though time would cover their stones in silence, the stories of their deeds would live on, retold, reshaped, reimagined. Mycenae was not eternal, but the myths it sparked would be. It gave the Greeks their heroes. It gave them memory, and in memory, it never truly died. The silent collapse. Then came the stillness. Around 1200 BCE, across much of the Mediterranean world, something changed. The great cities began to fall, not in one day, not from one cause, but like a long breath slowly leaving the body. Mycenae crumbled, Pylos burned, trade routes went quiet, writing disappeared. It was as if the world exhaled and forgot how to breathe. Historians call it a collapse, but for those who lived it, it must have felt like forgetting how to build, how to write, how to speak across the sea. The world grew smaller. The lights went dim. This was not just Greece. Egypt, Hatti, and Ugarit all felt the tremble. It was a storm of change with no single storm cloud. Earthquakes may have shaken cities. Invaders may have crossed from the sea. Drought, rebellion, or simply exhaustion, all may have played their part. But in the end, the world that had once danced with color and marched in bronze stood still. The palaces were empty, the tablets were silent, the myths were all that remained. But silence is not death. Beneath the quiet, seeds remained. In villages tucked in valleys, in fishermen's tales passed by firelight, in small, forgotten altars, on lonely hills, something endured. The Greeks did not vanish. They waited. And in that long, dark pause, the soul of Greece began to turn inward. The great kings were gone, but the people remembered. The gods still stirred in the wind. And somewhere, in a child's song or an elder's memory, the stories slept. One day, they would wake again, with fire, with thought, with language that shaped the world. But for now, Greece rested. The stones cooled. The ships stayed in harbor. The skies looked down, unchanged. And in the silence after collapse, the land dreamed once more, waiting for the light to return. Chapter 2. The Age of Heroes. Before books, before carved stone and painted vases, there were voices around the fire. And in those voices lived a war, not just of spears and shields, but of hearts torn between glory and grief. The story was of Troy, of kings and warriors, of a siege that would last 10 long years. But at the heart of that tale was a single man's fury. Achilles, the mightiest of the Greeks, a warrior born of a goddess and a mortal man, stood at the edge of legend and wrath. His anger, kindled by insult and pride, burned hotter than the fires that consumed the Trojan gates. The Iliad did not begin with the building of ships or the start of battle. It began with that rage, the kind that tears even the strongest apart. When Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek army, dishonored him, Achilles withdrew from the fight. The greatest warrior laid down his arms, and in his absence, the Greeks faltered. But his fury grew, silent and cold, until grief ignited it once more. The death of Patroclus, his dearest companion, shattered him. With tear-streaked eyes and a heart full of vengeance, Achilles returned to the battlefield not for glory, but for justice. The Iliad is not a tale of victory. Troy does not fall within its lines. Instead, it is a story of what war costs, of how even the strongest bend under the weight of loss. Achilles slays Hector, the prince of Troy, but it is not triumph he finds, it is mourning. He returns the body to Hector's father, King Priam, in a moment of quiet mercy. In that act, rage softens into sorrow, and the story closes, not with drums, but with stillness. The Iliad teaches that to be heroic is not only to fight, but to feel, to fall, and to forgive. In Achilles, the Greeks saw the sharp edge of pride and the deeper ache of being human. The Odyssey, a longing soul. If the Iliad is about the fires of war, the Odyssey is about the long walk home through the ashes. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, did not fight for power or revenge. He fought to return to the wife he loved, the son he barely knew, and the land that held his roots. But the sea would not let him go easily. For 10 years he wandered, not just across waves, but through the chambers of longing and temptation. The Odyssey is not simply a journey. It is the echo of every soul trying to find its way back to what matters. Odysseus faced monsters, the one-eyed Cyclops, the song of the sirens, the wrath of Poseidon. He floated between life and death, between islands of danger and places of rest. But his greatest tests were not of strength, they were of choice. When he stayed too long with the enchantress Circe, or when he lay in the arms of Calypso, it was not swords that bound him, it was forgetting. The longer he wandered, the more fragile his memory became. Yet even when the horizon blurred, the image of Penelope and Ithaca pulled him forward like a thread through the maze. At last, worn by time and sorrow, Odysseus returned, not as a hero with banners, but as a stranger cloaked in humility. He revealed himself not with noise, but with wisdom. He reclaimed his home with quiet purpose and faithful love. The Odyssey shows that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, the patience to endure, the strength to hope, the will to begin again. In Odysseus, the Greeks saw a mirror of life's long road, full of turns, trials, and the deep aching need to belong. The power of oral tradition. Long before the written word, there were the keepers of memory, the bards. These were not mere singers, but living vessels of history and truth. They carried stories like sacred flames, passing them from voice to voice, heart to heart. The tales of Achilles and Odysseus were not read in silence, but spoken aloud. In Aia, great halls and humble homes, listeners sat as the poets sang, his voice rising and falling like waves, his rhythm a guide through the vast sea of memory. These performances could last for days. They were not entertainment alone, but education, ceremony, and connection. In the repetition of lines and the patterns of verse, the Greeks remembered who they were. They learned the cost of pride, the weight of loyalty, the shape of courage. Bards like Homer, whether one man or many, turned history into poetry and myth into morality. The structure of the epics, with their careful phrases and repeated scenes, made them easier to recall and harder to forget. Through oral tradition, the past stayed alive. Children grew up hearing of the wooden horse, of the bow no man could string, of the ships that sailed with painted eyes to ward off evil. These stories were not locked in books, but lived in breath. They traveled with soldiers and shepherds, with kings and fishermen. They were told under stars and beside hearths, stitching the many Greek lands into one shared soul. In this way, the voice became a vessel and memory a map, guiding each generation back to the heroes who walked before them. Heroes as mirrors. Greek heroes were not gods. They were not perfect. They stumbled, broke, and wept. They made mistakes that cost lives. But it was in their flaws that they became unforgettable. Achilles was proud to the point of ruin. Odysseus lied and lingered. Heracles was strong but often reckless. These figures were not meant to be worshipped without question. They were meant to be studied, reflected upon, and wrestled with. In their stories, the Greeks found questions about themselves, about what it meant to be good, to be strong, to be human. These heroes lived in a world of honor, where reputation was currency and memory was everything. But they also showed that true greatness comes with burden, the pain of choice, the shadow of regret, the ache of love lost. They showed that strength could be silent, that courage could mean waiting, and that even the mighty are afraid. The Greeks did not hide these traits. They told them boldly, turning their heroes into mirrors of the soul. By telling and retelling these lives, the Greeks shaped their values. They taught that arrogance leads to downfall, that justice must balance power, that the gods may guide, but it is the heart that decides. Each tale became a thread in a larger fabric, one woven not only with triumphs, but with trials. In the age of heroes, the Greeks looked not for perfection, but for meaning. They found it in wounds, in wanderings, in the quiet truths behind loud deeds. And as they passed these tales from one generation to the next, they passed more than stories. They passed wisdom, not carved in stone, but held in the hand of the listener. They passed the courage to face fate, the patience to return, the grace to forgive. In doing so, they kept the age of heroes alive, not in temples or tombs, but in hearts that still listen when the world grows quiet and the story begins again. Chapter 3. From Darkness to Dawn. When the palaces of Mycenae fell, they did not crumble alone. Along with their stones and treasures, a world of knowledge and connection faded into silence. Writing disappeared. Trade with distant lands stopped. Great halls once filled with stories, leaders and artisans stood empty. The people who remained did not vanish, but they stepped into a quieter time, a long night in history, where the lights of civilization dimmed and survival became the song of each day. Greece entered what many later called a dark age, but for those who lived through it, it was simply life, quieter, harder, but still full of breath. Without great cities to guide them, people turned to the land. Small farms spread across valleys. Families gathered in tiny villages nestled between hills. They grew what they could, raised animals, and passed on what little they remembered. The focus shifted from kings to kin, from luxury to need, from power to peace. Yet, even in the stillness, something stirred. The memory of old glories did not die. It merely sank deeper, like seeds under the soil. People remembered in fragments, a hero's name, a lost song, a story whispered by firelight. Slowly, they built a new world, not with gold or marble, but with hands, hearts, and hope. The long night was not an end. It was a space for something else to grow, quieter, more rooted, and ready for the dawn. Iron and simplicity. In this new world, bronze, once the lifeblood of weapons and tools, became rare. The trade routes that brought tin and copper had vanished. But people adapted, as they always do. From the mountains and dark earth of Greece, they began to shape a new metal, iron. It was harder to work, rougher to wield, but it came from the land itself. It belonged to the people. Iron was not reserved for kings or armies. It was found and forged by everyday hands. Farmers used it to shape stronger plows. Villagers made tools that lasted longer, cut deeper. Weapons became simpler but more widespread. No longer did a warrior need wealth to fight. Slowly, the balance began to shift. The gap between rich and poor grew a little narrower. The tools of survival and power were no longer held by the few. With this change came a deeper one. Simpler living gave birth to simpler thinking, not less intelligent, but more shared. People began to speak of fairness, of voice, of balance in decision. The idea that a man could have a say in his community, not just obey orders, began to take root. It was still small, still fragile, but it was there. In village councils, in shared fields, in equal work. This shift, born of iron and simplicity, was the slow beginning of what would one day become democracy. The power of memory. Without writing, the past lived only in minds and mouths. There were no books to turn, no scrolls to open. But the Greeks did not forget. They remembered differently. They became masters of memory. Around the fire, elders told stories of gods and giants, of wars and wonders, of heroes long gone but never lost. These tales were not just for joy. They were lessons, values, identity. They were the way one generation spoke to the next. In a world without paper, rhythm and repetition became tools. Verses followed patterns, names repeated like prayers. Each line built on the last, making it easier to recall. And from this tradition rose voices like Homer's, voices that carried the epics of the past across time. The Iliad, the Odyssey, they were not read. They were heard, and in the hearing, people saw who they had been and who they might become. But memory was more than myth. Customs, songs, even the steps of a ritual, all were held in the memory of the people. Laws were spoken, not written. Histories were chanted. In markets, temples, and homes, the Greeks lived surrounded by the past, not buried in it, but cradling it. This memory was not perfect, but it was powerful. It gave them a thread to follow, a light in the darkness. And as they held on to these stories, they unknowingly built a bridge to the future. Seeds of the polis, even in small scattered villages, the spirit of community began to grow stronger. People learned to depend on one another, for harvest, for protection, for survival. And as these bonds deepened, something new began to form. The polis. It was not yet the grand city-state of Athens or Sparta, but its roots were here, in shared wells, in common festivals, in the gathering of neighbors to solve problems and protect their land. The polis was more than a place. It was a sense of belonging, a shared identity. Each village or town began to see itself not just as a group of people, but as a single voice, a single heart. They built altars together. They made laws together. they began to think not just of family, but of fellow citizens. The idea of citizenship, of being part of a whole with rights and duties, began here, humble and quiet. Over time, these early communities grew stronger, clearer in shape. They built walls, not to dominate, but to defend. They chose leaders, not because of birth, but because of trust. They gave each other names and gods to call their own. And while they might still be small, each polis became a world in itself, a center of thought, belief, and hope. The seeds were planted of freedom, of identity, of unity. And though no one yet knew what they would become, they grew in silence. The age of kings had ended. The age of citizens had begun, still young, still searching, but filled with quiet strength. In this dawn of the polis, ancient Greece found its path forward. Chapter 4: The Rise of the Polis. As the sun rose over ancient hills and the early mists clung to olive branches and stone paths, something new stirred in the Greek world. Not a king, not an empire, but a city with a soul. It was called the polis. This word, simple on the tongue, carried weight in the heart. A polis was not merely a place where people lived. It was where they belonged. It was both earth and idea, both structure and spirit. The polis became the center of Greek life, and through it, the Greek people redefined what it meant to live together. Each polis was small in size, often just a few thousand citizens, but it pulsed with life. At its crown stood the Acropolis, the high point of the city, a place of protection, reverence, and vision. Here temples reached for the sky, built to honor the gods who watched over each city-state. Below, nestled within winding streets and sunlit courtyards, lay the agora, the public square where daily life unfolded like a slow and thoughtful melody. There were no towering monuments yet, no grand armies or empires, only people learning to shape their world together. What set the polis apart was its sense of shared responsibility. Citizenship was not something one simply inherited. It was something one practiced. To be a citizen was to take part in decision-making, to show up, to speak, to serve. Even if only a portion of the population held this role, the idea that ordinary people could govern themselves was revolutionary. A man did not just live in the city. He was part of its voice, its defense, its future, and in that shared identity, the Greeks found pride, purpose, and possibility. Each polis was its own universe, independent, self-governed, fiercely proud. Corinth, Thebes, Athens, Sparta, each had its own traditions, heroes, dialects, and gods. Some loved trade, others honored war, but all embraced the core idea, the city-state as a living, breathing community. In these early steps, Greece found not just a way to organize land, but a way to organize life, rooted in participation, guided by memory, and lifted by hope. The polis was more than a political unit. It was a living heartbeat, and through it, Greek civilization began to bloom. The shape of society. Within the sturdy walls of the polis, society took on its own shape. Complex, layered, and deeply human. Life was not lived equally by all, but it was structured in a way that allowed the city to function, to evolve, and to reflect its values. At the top stood the citizens, free adult males born to the polis. They were the voices in the assembly, the shields in the phalanx, and the hands that helped steer the ship of their city. Citizenship brought both privilege and duty, and it was this sense of shared burden that defined the strength of the early polis. Beneath them, though rarely seen in the public eye, were the women. Excluded from formal politics, their influence ran deep within the home and sacred spaces. Women raised sons to defend the city and daughters to carry on its customs. They managed households, preserved family honor, and performed crucial roles in religious rites. At festivals and in temples, they became caretakers of tradition, weaving memory into ritual and presence into permanence. Though history often overlooked them, the polis leaned quietly on their strength. Then there were the metics, resident foreigners. These individuals, while not citizens, played essential roles in commerce, craftsmanship, and communication. Many were merchants from faraway lands who brought with them new goods, ideas, and flavors. Their hands built ships, their minds sharpened trade, and their voices added texture to the language of the streets. They lived within the walls, but remained outside the political circle. Always important, but never central. A reminder of both openness and limitation. And below all stood the enslaved. People with no rights, taken in war or born into bondage. They worked the fields, served in homes, and kept the wheels of daily life turning. Their presence was constant, their voices silent. The polis depended on them, even as it denied their place within its civic dream. Their labor built the strength of the city, but their names often slipped into shadows. Yet even within these boundaries, the idea of a shared society took root. The polis, for all its inequalities, dared to ask a question new in the ancient world. What does it mean to live together? Not just by command, but by choice. This question echoed in the stones of the city, in the rituals of daily life, and in the slow awakening of thought. It was here that the seeds of political philosophy began to grow, even if the soil was not yet fully just. In the polis, the Greeks were not only building cities, they were building a new kind of society. The agora, heart of the people. At the center of every polis was a space both open and alive. The agora. It was not a marketplace alone, though goods were traded, coins exchanged, and stalls filled with olives, fish, and clay jars. The agora was much more. It was the heart of the people, the space where private thought met public life. In its open, air and stone-paved paths, citizens gathered not only to buy, but to speak, to listen, to shape the world they lived in. Here, ideas were currency. One could hear a farmer speak of harvests, a philosopher question the stars, or a craftsman debate fairness in trade. Politics did not hide in halls. It breathed in the agora. Assemblies met under the sky. Decisions were made in plain view, and, though the voices belonged to citizens alone, those voices were loud, passionate, and shaped by argument as much as by agreement. It was in the agora that early forms of democracy took their first steps. The act of speaking one's mind, of persuading, of voting. These became rituals of daily life. And around these civic conversations, life flowed. Children ran between columns. Vendors shouted the price of figs. Musicians plucked strings in the shade. The agora was a blend of sacred and simple, where the affairs of gods and grain could unfold side by side. Over time, it became more than just a square. It became a symbol. The agora was where citizens learned to be citizens, not through birth, but through action. It taught listening, compromise, pride, and accountability. And in its open spaces, philosophy found fertile ground. The questions that would later echo through Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's teachings began here, not in books, but in laughter, disagreement, and quiet thought beneath the sun. sacred ground, and stone temples. Above the city, often standing, tall against the horizon, rose the Acropolis, sacred ground, lifted high. Here, temples reached toward the sky, built in stone and silence, to honor the gods who guarded the polis. Each city had its divine patron: Athena for Athens, Apollo for Delphi, Artemis for Ephesus. These gods were not distant beings. They were woven into daily life. The polis was not just political, it was spiritual. Temples were more than places of worship. They were statements of identity, markers of belief, and centers of unity. Built with careful precision, each column and frieze carried meaning. The architecture itself was a form of devotion, beauty, and balance offered to the heavens. Festivals filled the streets with music, dance, and sacrifice. Processions wound through city roads. Offerings were placed in sacred fires. In these rituals, the polis reminded itself of its place in the cosmos, small but not forgotten. Religion, in the polis, was communal. It was not about private salvation, but shared harmony. To honor the gods was to care for the city. To neglect ritual was to invite imbalance. And so, worship became another way to belong, another way to say, we are here together under the eyes of the divine. Even in politics, the sacred lingered. Oracles were consulted. Oaths were sworn on altars. The gods were present in law and land. They blessed the harvest, the assembly, the army. And their presence was not only felt, but seen. In temples rising, like prayers turned to stone. As the Greek world matured, the polis grew in shape and spirit. It was not perfect. It had flaws, exclusions, and silences, but it was alive. And in its streets, its squares, and its sanctuaries, the foundations of Western thought, governance, and community were quietly being laid, stone by stone, voice by voice, soul by soul. Chapter 5. Athens Awakens. In the hills of Attica, where the land rolled down toward the sea and olive trees stretched toward the sky, a city stirred with questions. Athens had begun to grow, not just in size, but in struggle. Beneath its rising rooftops and sacred altars, something darker stirred: unrest, inequality, and a growing pain that came from within. The rich had grown richer, and the poor were trapped in debts so deep they had lost their land, their freedom, and in some cases, even their families. Slavery loomed over the common man, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of poverty. The city, beautiful and bright on the outside, was crumbling from within. Into this moment stepped a man of balance, Solon. He was not a conqueror, not a king, but a thinker, a poet, and a reformer. The people trusted him because he was neither greedy nor cruel, and because he listened. Solon saw that war would only deepen the wounds. Instead, he offered something rare in those days: reform through reason. He was asked to lead Athens, not with a sword, but with laws. What followed was not a violent revolution, but a gentle one, a reshaping of power through words. Solon cancelled crushing debts. He forbade the selling of Athenians into slavery for money owed. He divided citizens into 4 classes, not to separate them, but to share responsibility. Even the poorest could now speak in court, and the wealthier were expected to lead with care. His changes were not perfect, and not all embraced them, but they breathed something new into Athens. The idea that justice could be shaped not by birthright, but by the will of many. Solon's reforms were a beginning, not an end. He left the city not in triumph, but in humility. hoping that time would prove his ideas sound. And though unrest would return, his vision lingered like soft light before dawn. In Solon's Athens, the dream of fairness found its first voice, not in conquest, but in courage to change the rules by which the people lived. The road to democracy. After Solon's departure, Athens entered a time of turmoil. The city's balance was delicate, and those who sought power still tried to seize it by force. Tyrants rose and fell. Factions clashed. At times, it seemed that Athens might fall into the same patterns that plagued other cities, where rule came from the strong, and the voices of the many were drowned by the will of the few. But amid the noise, another figure emerged, Cleisthenes. Where Solon had laid the foundation, Cleisthenes dared to build. He understood that if Athens was to be a city of the people, it needed to break from the grip of old families and rigid lines. So he did something bold. He redrew the map, not the land itself, but the lines of identity. No longer would power rest in ancient clans. He divided Athens into new tribes, formed not by blood, but by geography and chance. This restructuring was more than administrative. It was symbolic. It meant that every man, no matter his lineage, had a place in the body of the state. The council, once closed to the few, was open to 500 citizens, chosen by lot. Offices rotated. Decisions were made by assembly. It was not yet democracy as we know it, but it was its seed. A system where citizens did not just follow laws, but helped shape them. In this new design, Athens did not promise equality in wealth or life, but it offered something more precious: equality in voice. The idea that any citizen might speak, vote, and guide the city became not only law but culture. And though many were still excluded, women, slaves, foreigners, the polis was learning to listen to itself. Through Cleisthenes, Athens chose a different kind of power, one that rose not from the tip of a spear, but from the sound of many voices echoing in one space. Pericles and the Golden Light. As decades passed, Athens grew not just in strength, but in soul. The reforms of Solon and Cleisthenes had planted the roots, but it was under Pericles that the tree blossomed. Pericles was not a king, but he led with vision, passion, and calm. His voice carried weight, not because it commanded, but because it convinced. He believed in Athens, not only as a place, but as a promise. Pericles oversaw a time of remarkable peace and prosperity. The city flourished in trade and thought. Its navy ruled the seas, its artists filled the streets with beauty, and its thinkers began asking questions that would shape the world for centuries. But more than buildings or fleets, Pericles invested in people, in their education, their dignity, their role in public life. He expanded access to political office, paid citizens for jury service, and made civic participation a mark of honor. Under his leadership, the arts blossomed. Theaters were built where tragedies and comedies explored the deepest parts of human nature. Sculptors carved figures so lifelike they seemed to breathe. Philosophers walked the shaded groves, speaking of justice, love, and the nature of the soul. And through it all, the people of Athens felt not only richer, but prouder, as if they were part of something larger, something radiant. Pericles understood that power, without purpose, was hollow. And so he guided Athens with purpose, toward beauty, toward thought, toward the ideal of democracy, however flawed. In his famous speech, honoring the fallen in war, he did not speak only of death, but of life, of what it meant to be part of a city that encouraged its people to dream. speak and live freely. Under Pericles, Athens became a light, not of empire, but of spirit, the Parthenon and civic pride. Atop the rocky outcrop of the Athenian Acropolis stands a temple unlike any other, the Parthenon. Built during the height of Pericles' leadership, it was not just an offering to the goddess Athena, but a symbol of Athens itself. Rising in graceful symmetry, its marble columns seemed to lift the sky. Every line was measured with care. Every sculpture spoke of struggle, victory, and divine favor. It was the city, carved in stone. The Parthenon was more than a building. It was an act of storytelling, of memory, belief, and pride. Its friezes showed the gods alongside mortals, the mythical beside the real. It celebrated the Panathenaic procession, a festival in which citizens walked together in devotion and joy. The temple told the story of a people who believed not only in the gods above, but in their own dignity and place beneath them. Built with the wealth of an empire and the hands of local craftsmen, the Parthenon became the most visible face of Athenian identity. It echoed Pericles' vision that greatness was not found only in conquest, but in culture. That a city's strength came not just from its walls, but from its ideas. Every time the sun rose and cast golden light across its stones, Athenians could look up and see themselves, not just as subjects or soldiers, but as citizens. Though centuries have passed and much has been lost, the Parthenon still stands, weathered, worn, yet powerful in presence. It reminds us of a moment when a city dared to imagine something more. Not just a temple, not just a system, but a way of life built on beauty, thought, and shared voice. In the quiet hours, as dusk softens the sky, its stones seem to whisper the same truth that Pericles once believed, that the greatness of a city lies in how it honors its people. Chapter 6: Sparta's Iron Heart. In the southern part of Greece, beyond the olive groves of Attica and the marble temples of Athens, lay a land of silence and steel, Sparta. Nestled in the valley of the Eurotas River, surrounded by mountains that seemed to guard its borders, Sparta was unlike any other city. Where others built in beauty, Sparta built in order. Where others spoke freely, Sparta listened in quiet resolve. Its way of life was strict, stripped of luxury, and designed for one purpose: survival through strength. Legend tells of a man named Lycurgus, a lawgiver who came to Sparta in a time of unrest. He brought with him not gold, not conquest, but a vision. He crafted a set of laws, simple, harsh, and enduring. According to tradition, Lycurgus forbade the use of gold and silver. He banned excessive wealth and luxury. He outlawed individual power and private indulgence. Instead, he shaped Sparta into a society where equality was sacred, obedience was law, and war was the highest calling. Under these laws, the city became something different, not a place for pleasure or philosophy, but a machine for discipline. Property was shared. Meals were eaten in public mess halls. Wealth was measured not by coins, but by contribution. The citizens of Sparta, known as Spartiates, lived not for themselves, but for the whole. They were trained to be hard, quiet, and loyal. Their city was not rich in culture, but in control. Lycurgus was said to have left Sparta after creating these laws, promising never to return until they were fully embraced. He vanished, and the laws remained, unchanging, unchallenged, etched into the soul of the state. Though it is unclear how much of Lycurgus's story is fact or myth, his legacy was real. Sparta did not change easily. It did not grow like other cities, but it endured, not through softness or splendor, but through its iron will. It chose not to expand outward, but to look inward, and in doing so, it became a place where silence spoke volumes, and law was stronger than gold. From birth to shield. In Sparta, a child was not simply born, they were evaluated. At birth, infants were inspected by elders. If they were deemed strong and healthy, they were allowed to live. If not, they were left behind. It was a system without sentiment, built on the belief that weakness threatened the whole. From the very beginning, life in Sparta was a test of the body, of the mind, of loyalty to the city. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their homes and placed into a state-run training program known as the agorge. There, childhood ended. The boys were grouped into packs and taught how to endure pain, hunger, cold, and fear. They learned to fight, to steal, to speak with purpose, and to survive with little. Punishment was severe, but it was not meant to break. It was meant to forge. The goal of the agorge was not just to create warriors, but citizens who would live and die for Sparta without hesitation. They were taught to obey without question, to move in unity, and to hold the shield as sacred, not for self-protection, but to guard the man beside them. A Spartan without his shield was a danger to the whole. Excellence in battle was not about glory, it was about trust. By the age of 20, a young Spartan was expected to be a soldier in full. He joined a mess hall with his fellow warriors, trained daily, and remained under military discipline for most of his life. Marriage was allowed, but even then, a Spartan man lived with his fellow soldiers. Family came second to duty. Individual dreams bowed before the needs of the city. This way of life was not warm, but it was precise. Sparta believed that freedom was protected by discipline. Its people were not encouraged to ask why. They were expected to act, and though it seemed harsh to the outside world, within Sparta, this was honor. To live for the city, to fight without fear, and to die without regret. Women of strength. While Spartan men trained for war, Spartan women held a different kind of power, one that set them apart from nearly every other woman in the Greek world. In Athens and elsewhere, women lived in the shadows of their homes, rarely seen in public, seldom educated. But in Sparta, women were raised strong, physically, mentally, and socially. They were expected to run, to wrestle, to train, not for battle, but for birth. A strong woman, they believed, bore strong children. Spartan girls received education, something rare in the ancient world. They studied music, poetry, and physical training. They were taught to speak clearly, to command respect, and to manage the household in the absence of their husbands. They could own land, inherit wealth, and express their opinions. In a world ruled by men, Sparta gave its women unusual space to lead, not in government, but in family and economy. Their voices mattered. They were known to speak openly, even sharply, and their presence was not hidden. During public festivals, they sang songs of valor, honoring those who returned from war and mourning those who did not. They dressed plainly but proudly, reflecting the values of their city. Beauty was measured not in softness, but in strength. This equality was not born of compassion, but of necessity. With men away at war or training year-round, women became the backbone of Spartan life. They managed estates, raised the next generation, and ensured the city's survival. In a society built on discipline and endurance, women were seen not as weak but essential. Their strength was silent but undeniable. And though they did not carry shields or march into battle, Spartan women shaped the warriors of Sparta. They taught them from birth that fear was shameful and that death in battle was the highest honor. In every Spartan soldier, there echoed the voice of a mother who once said, "Return with your shield," or "on it." Enemies within behind. Sparta's strength, however, lay a deeper truth, one often hidden in the shadows of its glory. The city's rigid system depended on a group of people who lived without rights, without voice, and often without hope. They were the Helots, and they were the backbone of Sparta's economy and its greatest threat. The Helots were originally free people from the surrounding lands, conquered by Sparta and forced into labor. They farmed the fields, raised crops, and provided food for the Spartan citizens who focused entirely on war. Unlike chattel slaves, Helots lived in family units, kept their homes, and practiced their traditions. But they were not free. They were bound to the land, unable to leave, and subject to brutal control. Spartans lived in constant fear of a Helot uprising. Their numbers were far greater than those of the citizens, and this imbalance led to paranoia. To keep them submissive, Sparta used a system of terror. Each year, a secret police known as the Cryptaia was sent out. Young Spartan men who roamed at night, silently executing any Helot who showed signs of resistance. It was a dark ritual of control, hidden behind the facade of order. This reliance on oppression gave Sparta stability, but at a terrible cost. It built walls not just around the city, but around its conscience. The silence of Sparta was not only discipline, it was the silence of those never allowed to speak. And while the world admired the strength of its soldiers, few saw the chains that kept its fields full and its citizens fed. Sparta's greatness came not from wealth or art, but from sacrifice, of freedom, of tenderness, and of those they ruled. Its society stood tall, but its foundations were brittle. Beneath the polished shields and flawless formations, the city carried a quiet, constant weight, a fear that the order it cherished could collapse if those beneath it ever rose. Chapter 7: Sacred Fires and Silent Stones. In the early light that touched the peaks of Greece, long before cities filled the valleys and ships filled the seas, the Greeks looked upward and inward and found the gods. Not distant, cold, or perfect, but near, passionate, and full of life. Their gods lived not beyond reach, but just above the clouds, on the high slopes of Mount Olympus. There, the divine felt close, and though unseen, their presence echoed in thunder, in breeze, in flame, and in silence. Mount Olympus was more than a mountain, it was a home. From its heights, the 12 Olympians looked down upon the world, not to dominate it, but to take part in its drama. They argued, they loved, they took sides in wars, and whispered into the hearts of men and women. Zeus ruled, with lightning in hand, a father of gods and a symbol of power. His wife Hera guarded marriage, but burned with jealousy. Poseidon stirred the seas and shook the earth. Demeter held the grain in her hands, her sorrow marking winter and her joy bringing spring. Each god reflected something deeply human. Aphrodite, radiant and unrelenting, stirred hearts and wove desire. Athena, born from the head of Zeus, stood for wisdom and war, justice and clarity. Apollo brought light, music and healing, but also plague. Artemis ran with wild beasts, her arrows sharp and her independence sacred. Dionysus danced on the edge of madness and ecstasy, while Ares reveled in battle's chaos. Hermes moved between worlds, clever, fast, a guide to both travelers and the dead. And Hestia, quiet and often forgotten, kept the flame of the hearth, anchoring home and peace. The Greeks did not separate heaven from earth. Their gods were everywhere, in the crashing waves, in the cry of a bird, in the chants of a roll of dice. These divine beings were woven into every story, every ritual, every prayer. They were not perfect ideals, but reflections, magnified mirrors of what it meant to be human. Through them, the Greeks explored their own joys and flaws, hopes and fears. Olympus stood high, but its stories ran deep into every village, every temple, and every beating heart below. Temples as portals scattered across the hills and islands. Of Greece, temples stood, not towering palaces of prayer, but measured spaces of balance, light, and silence. Unlike places of worship in other lands or later times, Greek temples were not built to gather crowds or host sermons. They were homes, not for people, but for presence. Each temple was made for a god, a space where the divine could rest, watch, and dwell. From a distance, a Greek temple rose like a still flame, made of marble or limestone, shaped by human hands but guided by deeper forces. They were aligned with the stars, with the path of the sun, with the cycles of earth and sky. Builders did not choose their shapes by chance. Every column, every step, every angle held meaning. The symmetry was sacred. The proportions were rooted in math and mystery. To enter a temple was not to attend a service. It was to step into a space where the ordinary world felt thin and something else seemed near. At the heart of the temple was the naos, the inner chamber. Here stood the statue of the god, not as a symbol, but as a presence. These statues were grand, carved with reverence, often made of gold and ivory. They looked out with eyes that never blinked. Offerings were made before them: oil, wine, incense, and bread. But the temple itself remained mostly still. The real worship happened outside, in the open air. Beneath the sky, the gods shared with mortals. These temples were portals, not for the gods to reach down, but for humans to reach up, to offer thanks, to seek favor, to be reminded of their place in the order of things. Each city had its sacred space. Athens had the Parthenon for Athena. Delphi had Apollo's grand seat. Ephesus held Artemis's temple, one of the ancient wonders of the world. These places were more than stone. They were memory. They were meaning. To walk among them was to walk with reverence. Each step echoed with centuries. Each silence was filled with the presence of gods who did not always speak, but who always listened. The oracles and the unknown. Though the gods were ever present, they rarely spoke clearly. Instead, the Greeks sought them in riddles, in symbols, in patterns barely visible through the smoke. And nowhere was this more sacred or more mysterious than Delphi. High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Delphi was believed to be the center of the world. According to legend, Zeus released two eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and they met there, marking it as sacred ground. It was here that the oracle of Apollo spoke, through a priestess called the Pythia. She did not shout, she did not preach. She sat on a tripod above a fissure in the earth, where vapors rose from deep below. Inhaling them, she would enter a trance, and her words, cryptic, layered, dreamlike, were heard as the voice of the god. Leaders, soldiers, farmers, all came to Delphi. They asked questions, offered sacrifices, and listened closely. The answers were never direct. They came as poetry, as puzzle, as possibility. The Greeks did not expect certainty. They looked for direction, for insight, for the shape of destiny hiding beneath the waves of chance. This way of seeking was not about control, but about alignment. To ask the oracle was to admit one's limits, to say, "I do not know, but I wish to see." And through this practice, the Greeks developed a deep respect for mystery. They did not believe they could command the divine, only observe, listen, and walk carefully in its shadow. Other oracles existed. In Dodona, where the rustle of oak leaves carried Zeus's voice, and in other remote shrines where silence was as sacred as sound. But Delphi remained the heart, a place where heaven bent close to earth, where the unknown was not feared, but welcomed. It reminded the Greeks that knowledge was not always found in facts, but in faith. That sometimes the most powerful answers were those we could barely understand. Mystery and initiation. While public temples and oracles shaped the visible path of Greek religion, there were other roads, quieter, deeper, and hidden from the world. These were the mysteries, sacred rites not spoken of, but passed through in silence. Chief among them were the mysteries of Eleusis, held each year just outside Athens. Thousands would walk the sacred road from the city to the sanctuary, in pilgrimage, in preparation, in search. What happened in Eleusis was secret. The Greeks believed that to speak of it was to strip it of its power. But we know enough to understand its soul. These rites centered around Demeter and Persephone, mother and daughter, goddess of grain and queen of the underworld. Their myth was one of loss, return, and the cycle of seasons. Persephone was taken into the realm of the dead, and in her grief, Demeter caused the earth to wither. When her daughter returned, so did the crops, and with them, hope. The initiation at Eleusis was more than a story told. It was a journey walked. Participants fasted, bathed, and prepared. Then, through night and sacred drama, they passed into the myth itself. There were lights, sounds, symbols that opened the heart without, needing to be explained. And at the end, a revelation, not of fact, but of feeling. A deep peace, a new vision. The mysteries offered no promise of wealth or power, but something far greater. A glimpse of eternal life, of the soul's resilience, of meaning beyond the veil of death. These rites did not divide people by class or status. Rich or poor, king or farmer, all stood equal in the eyes of the divine during initiation. What mattered was not who you were, but your willingness to surrender, to listen, to be changed. The mysteries were not entertainment. They were transformation. Even today, their full meaning remains hidden, but the Greeks carried them close. In a world of war, politics, and change, the mysteries whispered of something still and sacred, that beyond the known, there was always more. A light behind the shadow, a fire behind the stone. Chapter 8: Games of Glory. In the warm sun of the western Peloponnese, where olive trees swayed gently and the Alpheus River wound its way through soft hills, a sacred grove waited in quiet majesty. This was Olympia, not just a place, but a promise. It was here, every 4 years, that the Greeks laid down their weapons, put aside their rivalries, and gathered for something greater than war, for glory, for honor, for the gods. The Olympic Games began in myth, as so much of Greek life did. Some said Heracles, the mighty son of Zeus, had first cleared the land and declared the sacred truce. Others whispered older stories of kings and rites and forgotten fire. But by the 8th century BCE, the tradition had become real, structured, solemn. and magnificent. The first recorded Olympic Games took place in 776 BCE, a moment that would echo through time. At the heart of these games was Zeus, king of the gods, ruler of storm and sky. A massive temple rose in his name, and inside stood a statue so grand it was counted among the 7 wonders of the world. But the glory of Olympia was not just in marble and gold. It lived in movement, in muscle, in the rhythm of bare feet against earth. Athletes arrived from every corner of the Greek world. They trained for months, sometimes years, and when they entered the sacred grounds of Olympia, they did so not only as individuals, but as offerings. Their strength was a gift to the gods, their speed, their grace, their skill, all forms of devotion. Races were run, javelins thrown, wrestlers grappled under the open sky. Each event echoed the body's power and the soul's will, and all of it began with peace. Before the games, a sacred truce, the Ekechiria, was declared. Even in times of war, Greek Peleus honored it. Envoys carried word of the truce across the land, reminding all that for these days, no sword would swing. It was not just a pause, it was a return to something older, something purer. At Olympia, they came not to conquer, but to celebrate. The games were not an escape from reality, but a mirror of what the Greeks hoped their world could be: strong, fair, united in the eyes of the divine. The ideal of arete, beneath every race, behind every throw, inside each struggle on the Olympic fields, was a word whispered in every Greek heart: arete. It meant excellence, but not just skill. Arete was the harmony of the body, the clarity of the mind, and the strength of the spirit. It was the pursuit of one's highest self, not for fame, not for gain, but because to strive was to be human, and to do so with grace was divine. The Greeks did not compete for coins or riches. The winner received a crown of olive leaves, sacred, simple, silent. No gold, no silver. Just the wreath, cut from a tree said to be planted by Heracles himself. But in that wreath was something more lasting than treasure. It was proof of arete. The victors carried their names home, not only as champions, but as symbols. They had pushed the limits of what the human form could do, and, more importantly, of what the human soul could endure. For the Greeks, to lose with honor was better than to win without virtue. The contest itself was sacred. The struggle, beautiful. A man who gave his all, who fought fairly, who fell and stood again, he too touched glory. Children were told of these efforts. Poets wove their names into verse. Statues were raised, not just for winners, but for the story behind each moment. Arete was not prideful. It was a quiet, powerful drive, a light that guided artists as well as athletes. It whispered to sculptors as they carved, to philosophers as they reasoned, to soldiers as they marched. But nowhere was it clearer than in the games, in the shine of sweat, the poise before the starting line, the silence just before the race began. In that stillness lived the soul of arete, to be not the best in the world, but the best within oneself. Pan-Hellenic unity. Greece was never one land. It was a patchwork of cities, each with its own laws, armies, and pride. Athens stood for thought, Sparta for order, Corinth for trade. They argued, they fought. They often saw themselves not as neighbors, but as rivals. And yet every 4 years, something miraculous happened. They came together as Greeks, as kin under the sky. And it was at the Games that this fragile, flickering unity was most clearly seen. The Olympics were not the only games. Delphi had the Pythian Games, honoring Apollo with music and poetry, as well as sport. Corinth hosted the Isthmian Games. Nemea held its own contests in sacred fields. These were the Pan-Hellenic Games, shared by all, respected by all, and through them, the Greeks remembered that beyond borders, they were bound by language, myth, and meaning. At Olympia, athletes arrived from places hundreds of miles apart, from distant islands, from mountain towns, from cities who had only weeks earlier stood on opposite sides of a battlefield. But here, they walked side by side. They swore the same sacred oaths. They stood beneath the same statues. They competed under the same sun. No one could fight or bring weapons to the games. Priests enforced this law with solemnity. The space itself was holy, untouched by the violence of the world beyond. And this peace, brief though it was, left a lasting impression. It reminded the Greeks of what they shared: the same gods, the same values, the same dream of harmony through strength. The games became a language, a place where deeds spoke louder than arguments, where the body's motion said what speeches could not. A sprinter from Delos, a discus thrower from Thebes, a wrestler from Argos. Each moved with purpose, with rhythm, with hope, and in their movement, the Greek people saw reflections of themselves, different but united, competing but connected. For a few sacred days, the divisions blurred, and in that unity, the games found their true power, victory and immortality. The cheers faded, the dust settled, the last race was run. But for the victors, the glory had only begun. Winning at Olympia meant more than a crown. It meant immortality, not in the body, but in memory. The names of champions were recorded, sung by poets, carved into stone. Cities welcomed them home with parades, gifts, even front-row seats at the theatre for life. Their likenesses were sculpted and placed within the sanctuary itself, standing forever beside gods and heroes. To win at the Olympics was to join a lineage, not just of athletes, but of legends. The sculptor Phidias built a statue of Zeus, so magnificent it left visitors breathless. Nearby stood likenesses of human beings, lean, proud, poised, whose names we still remember. Milo of Croton, who won again and again in wrestling. Leonidas of Rhodes, who sprinted like the wind. They became part of the collective soul of Greece, yet even those who did not win left their mark. Their effort, their struggle, their willingness to push against the limits of their own strength, all were remembered. The Greeks understood that time forgets many, but honors those who strive nobly. And in the sacred spaces of Olympia, those stories lingered. Every column, every carved relief whispered of those who once ran barefoot, who once gripped the javelin with trembling hands, who once stood beneath the sun with nothing but willpower and faith. The Olympics gave no coins, no thrones, no lands, but they gave something far rarer: the chance to be remembered not for what one owned, but for who one had dared to become. To be carved in stone, to be sung by bards, to have one's name echo in the breath of a child retelling the story. That was victory, that was eternity. Chapter 9. When Persia Knocked. In the east, beyond the blue of the Aegean and the scattered Greek isles, lay the Persian Empire, vast, wealthy, and unstoppable. Its roads stretched from the mountains of India to the rivers of Egypt. Its kings ruled with gold in one hand and an army in the other. To many, it seemed eternal, unbreakable. But to the Greeks of Asia Minor, the Ionian cities, Persia was not a marvel. It was a master, and eventually, even silence finds a voice. The Ionian Greeks had lived on the coast of modern-day Turkey for generations. Cities like Miletus, Ephesus, and Halicarnassus had thrived, trading, writing, worshipping, and wandering. But they were not free. Under Persian rule, they paid tribute, they bowed to satraps. Their rulers, often Greek in name, were loyal to Persia in practice, and in time, resentment began to build like storm clouds over the sea. Around 499 BCE, that storm broke. The city of Miletus, led by a bold man named Aristagoras, rose in rebellion. He reached out to the mainland for help. Athens and Eretria answered the call. They sent ships, not many, but enough to light the fire. The Ionian revolt began. Together, the Greeks attacked Sardis, one of Persia's regional capitals, and set it ablaze. The fire rose, so did Persian rage. Though the revolt was short-lived, crushed within a few years, its impact was lasting. To Darius, the Persian king, the insult was not forgotten. The Greeks had dared to strike his empire, to touch his land with flame. He took it personally, and so began a long and winding war, not over riches, not even over land, but over dignity. The rebellion in Ionia was not just a spark, it was a signal. Persia was coming, and Greece, fragmented and proud, would soon have to choose, surrender or stand. The Battle of Marathon. In 490 BCE, the Persian tide reached the Greek mainland. Darius sent a vast fleet westward, across the sea, across the wind, to punish Athens and Eretria for their part in the Ionian revolt. They landed at a place called Marathon, a broad plain east of Athens, quiet under the summer sun. From the ships came soldiers in shining armor, archers, cavalry, banners fluttering with the breath of empire. They outnumbered the Greeks by far. Athens called for help. Sparta, locked in a religious festival, delayed, and so the Athenians stood nearly alone. 10,000 men, farmers, artisans, citizens, gathered on the hills above Marathon, led by generals who knew the odds but chose to fight anyway. Among them was Miltiades, a man who had once served in Persia and now sought redemption through resistance. For days, the two armies stared across the plain. Then, on a morning draped in stillness, the Greeks moved first. They ran, not walked, toward the enemy, across open ground. The Persians, used to archers softening their foes first, were caught off guard. The Greek phalanx hit like a wave of iron. The center bent, but the wings held firm. In that moment of tension, the Athenians surrounded their foes. The Persians faltered. They fled. The numbers were staggering. Persia lost thousands, Greece only a few hundred. It was not just a battle won, it was an idea reborn, that a small force, driven by freedom and courage, could beat the greatest power on earth. The victory at Marathon echoed across the land. It gave the Greeks more than confidence. It gave them a story, of valor, of defiance, of what it meant to be free. And from that field, legend says a runner was sent to Athens. He raced the 26 miles without pause, delivering the news of victory before collapsing in death. Whether myth or memory, the message was clear. When courage moves faster than fear, even empires can be stopped. Thermopylae. Last stand of the brave. 10 years passed. Darius died, and his son Xerxes took the throne. He inherited not just an empire, but a promise to avenge the defeat at Marathon. In 480 BCE, he gathered one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. By land and sea it came, across bridges of boats stretched over the Hellespont, through fields and forests, toward the heart of Greece. The storm had returned. The Greek cities, though often divided, now saw the need to unite. Athens, Sparta, and others formed an alliance. They sent scouts, they planned defenses, and at a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, they chose to make a stand. Thermopylae, the hot gates, became the line between freedom and conquest. Leading the defense was Leonidas, king of Sparta. With him were 300 of his elite warriors, each with sons to carry on their name, for none expected to return. Joined by a few thousand allies from other cities, they held the pass with discipline and resolve. For 2 days, they turned back wave after wave of Persian assault. The narrow terrain made Persian numbers useless. Greek shields held firm. Their courage shone like polished bronze. But betrayal came. A Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a hidden path through the mountains. Surrounded, Leonidas knew the end had come. He dismissed most of the allies, keeping only his Spartans and a few others. They fought to the last man. Spears broke, swords dulled, still they held. Their defeat was not the end. It was a beginning. Thermopylae did not stop the Persian advance, but it changed the spirit of the war. Across Greece, the tale spread, how a handful of men faced a sea of foes and stood without fear. It became a symbol, a call, a memory etched into marble and mind, the last stand of the brave, not just for Sparta, but for all who believe some things are worth more than life. Salamis and the sea's verdict. With the pass at Thermopylae breached, Xerxes pushed south. Athens was abandoned. The people fled to nearby islands. The city, sacred and strong, was burned. The Acropolis fell, but not the spirit of Athens. In the straits of Salamis, where narrow waters curled around rocky shores, a new defense was formed, this time not on land, but at sea. Themistocles, an Athenian general and statesman, saw what others did not. He knew that Greece could not win in open battle, but in tight spaces, where maneuver mattered more than mass, there was hope. He sent false messages to lure the Persians into the straits. And Xerxes, eager for a final blow, took the bait. The Persian navy was vast, row upon row of ships, sleek, armed, ready. But the narrow channels turned their numbers into a weakness. The Greek ships, smaller and swifter, struck with precision. They rammed. They boarded. They turned the sea into a storm of wood and fire. From a golden throne on a hillside, Xerxes watched as his fleet shattered. Salamis was a turning point. Persia still had power, but its grip began to slip. The sea, once a path for invasion, had become a shield for Greece. Themistocles had proved that intellect could outmatch size, that strategy could carve victory from impossible odds. In the years that followed, more battles came, at Plataea, at Mycale, and slowly Persia withdrew. But it was at Salamis where the tide truly turned, where the water spoke, where the wind carried not the sound of retreat, but the rhythm of resistance. Greece had survived, not through luck, but through unity, courage, and the quiet brilliance of minds like Themistocles. And so the story of the Persian Wars ended not with conquest, but with freedom. Greece, though scarred, had held, and from that fire, a new confidence was born. The belief that a small people, when joined in purpose, could stand against the storm and endure. Chapter 10. The Golden Light of Athens. After the storm of the Persian Wars, a different kind of dawn broke over Athens. The city, scorched but unbroken, rose with new purpose. The fire that had consumed its temples was not only destructive, it was transformative. What emerged was not simply a rebuilt Athens, but a reimagined one, and at its center stood something the world had never seen: a democracy finding its voice. In the 5th century BCE, Athenian democracy reached its height. It was not perfect. It did not include women, slaves, or foreigners. But within its narrow circle, it offered something extraordinary, a chance for ordinary citizens to guide the destiny of their city. No king gave orders. No nobleman made all the laws. Instead, free men gathered in the ecclesia, the assembly, to speak, vote, and shape public policy. They debated war, judged crimes, and chose leaders by lot, trusting that wisdom was not limited to birth or wealth. The Boule, a council of 500 citizens, prepared the agenda. Courts of hundreds, even thousands, listened to arguments and made decisions without judges. And within this strange and sacred order, the people of Athens discovered a new rhythm, a rhythm where power pulsed not from palaces, but from the gathering of voices under open sky. Democracy in Athens was noisy, it was messy, it was full of contradictions, but it was alive. Citizens felt it in their bones. To speak was a duty, to listen, a virtue. The agora, once a place of trade alone, became a field of thought, where ideas were weighed like silver, and justice was always just one speech away. This system demanded much. Citizens had to be informed, attentive, and present. They were not governed from above, but from within. And in this experiment, radical in its simplicity, Athens carved a model that would echo across millennia, that the will of the people, however flawed, could guide the course of a nation. The theatre of thought. As democracy flourished, so too did drama. In Athens, the theatre was not just entertainment, it was sacred. Every spring, citizens gathered at the foot of the Acropolis, in the theatre of Dionysus, to witness something more than a play. They came to wrestle with questions too large for daily life. Here, under open skies, truth wore a mask, and wisdom spoke through song. Greek tragedy did not avoid pain, it embraced it. The works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored betrayal, revenge, divine silence, and human pride. Their heroes were not perfect. They stumbled, doubted, and bled, and in their suffering, the audience saw themselves. These were not myths made distant. They were mirrors, polished with poetry, heavy with meaning. Sophocles gave the world Oedipus Rex, a story of fate and blindness, of a man who sought truth and found ruin. Euripides wrote of Medea, a woman betrayed, whose vengeance burned too bright. These plays did not give easy answers. They asked hard questions. What is justice? What is honor? Can suffering lead to wisdom? Every play was watched by thousands, rich and poor, old and young. All sat together shoulder to shoulder. They wept, they gasped, they were silent. The chorus guided them, commenting in rhythm, like the voice of conscience woven into the story. And when the play ended, they left not only entertained, but changed. Comedy too had its place. Sharp, satirical, biting. Aristophanes mocked politicians, philosophers, and the very system Athens held dear. But even laughter carried weight. In the theatre, thought became visible, emotion became lesson, and the city, in watching itself, grew more aware of its flaws, its fears, its potential. This was the soul of Athens: to speak the unspoken, to face the unbearable, to find beauty not in hiding from pain, but in naming it aloud. Art, architecture, and the human form Athens reached not only for justice and thought, it reached for beauty. After the wars, the city turned to building, not in defiance of the past, but in honor of the future. From white marble and golden stone, a vision emerged, one of balance, proportion, and grace. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis like a hymn, in stone. Built for Athena, the city's patron goddess, it was more than a temple. It was an expression of harmony. Every column leaned slightly inward. Every line was subtly curved. Nothing was by accident. The building corrected the illusions of the eye, bending just enough so that to the viewer it seemed perfectly straight. It was a structure that honored both gods and geometry. Sculptors, too, found a new language. They moved away from the rigid forms of the past and towards something softer, more human. The body was no longer a symbol, it was a story. Muscles moved, faces thought. A boy tying a sandal, a woman adjusting her robe. The everyday became eternal. Phidias, the master sculptor, filled the Parthenon with life. His statues of Athena and Zeus towered in size but whispered with subtlety. Draped robes clung to skin. Eyes looked beyond the present. Movement flowed like breath held in marble. Even pottery told stories. Vases bore scenes of myth, of athletes, of weddings and funerals. Every surface, a canvas. Every detail, a conversation between artist and time. To the Athenians, beauty was not luxury. It was truth, not perfection without flaw, but balance within complexity. They believed that through art, one could approach the divine, not by escaping the world, but by revealing it fully and faithfully. Philosophers in the agora, amid the columns and conversations of Athens, thought became more than a pastime. It became a practice, a way of life, and from its streets emerged some of the most influential minds the world has ever known. Socrates was the first, a man with no school, no writings, only questions. He wandered the marketplace, asking bakers, soldiers, shoemakers, what is justice? What is courage? How should we live? He believed wisdom began in knowing that one did not know. His method was simple, his presence unforgettable. Some found him inspiring, others found him dangerous. In the end, his questions cost him his life. Charged with corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, he was sentenced to drink poison. And still, he questioned, even in death. Plato, his student, carried his voice forward. He founded the Academy, the first true school of philosophy. He wrote in dialogue, shaping conversations between teacher and student, dreamer and realist. In his vision, the world we see was only a shadow of a greater truth, a realm of perfect forms beyond the senses, known through reason alone. Then came Aristotle, grounded, curious, tireless. He studied everything: politics, biology, ethics, poetry. To him, knowledge was not only about ideas, but about observing the world as it was. He taught that virtue came through habit, that happiness was the purpose of life, and that balance was the path to wisdom. Together, these thinkers changed not just Athens, but the world. They turned daily questions into timeless quests. They treated thought not as an escape from life, but as a guide within it. And in the streets of Athens, beneath its statues, beside its fountains, beneath the fading light of the sun, these men walked and talked and wondered. Their voices have long since faded, but their questions remain, gentle, probing, persistent, like the echo of footsteps on worn stone, still searching, still asking. Chapter 11. shadows of war. After the Persian threat faded, Athens stood tall among the ashes, not just rebuilt, but transformed. Its walls rose again, its navy ruled the waves, its thinkers reshaped the mind, and its artists captured the soul. But power, like fire, warms and wounds. Beneath the glow of marble temples and democratic pride, something darker began to stir. What had once been a fellowship of defense was becoming something else, something harder, something feared. The Delian League had started with noble intent, a coalition of Greek city-states, led by Athens, united to guard against future Persian invasion. Each member contributed ships or silver, pooled together to maintain freedom. Through strength, the treasury was kept on the sacred island of Delos, neutral and revered. At first, it was a partnership, a shield for all. But slowly, quietly, the shield became a chain. When some cities wished to leave the League, Athens said no. When contributions were questioned, Athens demanded more. When rebellion sparked, Athens crushed it. The treasury was moved from Delos to Athens, a symbol of control. Funds meant for defense were used to build temples, walls, and theaters in the capital. Allies became subjects. The League became an empire. Athens, draped in wisdom and culture, now ruled through its fleet. Tribute poured in, ships patrolled the seas. Its own citizens grew wealthy, while others paid the price. Pride whispered in the streets, and ambition crept through the courts. To the Athenians, this power felt natural, even deserved. But to others, especially to Sparta, it felt like dominance masked in the language of justice. And so, behind the brilliance of Athens, resentment grew. Quiet at first, then louder. Cities watched as freedom narrowed, and in the tension between past partnership and present control, war found its shadow. Sparta's challenge. Sparta had always been cautious. Unlike Athens, it did not seek glory in temples or fame in sculpture. It prized order, tradition, strength. Its power was quiet, rooted in discipline. But as Athens grew louder, bolder, richer, Sparta watched and worried. The Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, mirrored the Delian League in structure, but not in spirit. Where Athens demanded tribute, Sparta allowed autonomy. Yet even this restraint had its edge. Beneath the surface, Sparta's pride bristled. It saw Athenian influence spreading to trade routes, to courts, to mines. It heard tales of Athenian arrogance, of allies turned into subjects, of democracy used as a tool of empire. In 431 BCE, the tension broke. After years of disputes, provocations, and uneasy truces, war erupted. It would not end for nearly 30 years. What followed was not one grand clash, but a slow unraveling, a war of attrition, sieges, betrayals, and shifting fortunes. Sparta, dominant on land, invaded Athenian territory each year, burning fields and homes. But Athens, protected by walls and fed by sea, held firm. Its navy raided coastal towns and blockaded enemy ports. Neither side could deliver a final blow. So the war dragged on, grinding, suffocating. Alliances shifted. Neutral cities were pulled into the storm. Some changed sides, others suffered for standing alone. Religion was used as justification. Fear replaced diplomacy. And in this widening conflict, the soul of Greece began to fade. Unity was forgotten. Each victory led only to more loss. Sparta's challenge had not only been to Athens, It had been to the very balance of the Greek world. And as the war deepened, it became clear even the mightiest cities could bleed. Plague and Pericles. In the second year of war, as Spartan soldiers once again marched into Athenian lands, Athens closed its gates. Its people flooded inside the long walls that stretched from the city to its harbour. Safe from invasion, but not from fate. For within those crowded streets, disease crept silently, and the plague began. It came swiftly. Fevers burned, tongues blackened, bodies weakened. The sick died by the hundreds, then thousands. No one knew its cause. Some said it was divine punishment. Others blamed tainted water, foreign traders, or foul winds from the sea. No explanation could ease the loss. Families vanished, priests faltered, rituals stopped, fear filled every breath. Among the dead was Pericles. Pericles had been more than a leader. He was the voice of reason, the light in Athens' golden age. He guided its democracy, shaped its vision, and steered it through the early years of war. He believed in Athens, not just in its might, but in its ideals. His death was more than personal grief. It was a fracture in the city's spirit. Without him, Athens drifted. New leaders rose, ambitious and bold, but lacking his restraint. Decisions were made in haste. Campaigns grew reckless. The city still sparkled, but its core began to crack. The plague did not win the war, but it changed it. It stole the city's breath and dimmed its clarity. It reminded the Athenians and the world that even the most enlightened can fall, and that nature, silent and unseen, can humble even the proudest minds. The slow fall. As years passed, the war ground on, not in triumph, but in weariness. Cities, once vibrant, now starved behind their walls. Armies marched not with pride, but out of habit. The lines between allies and enemies blurred. Even victories felt hollow. Athens made bold moves. An ambitious expedition to Sicily meant to open new fronts and resources, but it ended in disaster. Ships were lost. Thousands of soldiers were captured, slaughtered, or enslaved. The failure shook Athens to its core. It was a blow from which it would never fully recover. Sparta too suffered. It won ground but lost faith. Its own system, built on discipline and fear, began to stretch. Revolts stirred among the helots. The cost of war bled into every home. There was no joy in conquest, only survival. Eventually, with the help of Persian gold, a bitter irony, as Sparta once fought Persia to defend Greek freedom, the Spartans built a navy to challenge Athens at sea. In 405 BCE, at the Battle of Aegospotami, the Athenian fleet was destroyed. The next year, Sparta laid siege to a starving Athens. The city surrendered. The war was over. Sparta had won, but the victory rang hollow. Athens was humbled, not erased. Sparta was supreme, but uneasy. The war had left deep scars, in land, in soul, in memory. Greece had fought itself into ruin. The ideals that once lit its way, freedom, balance, beauty, were dimmed. And yet, from this fall, echoes would remain. The questions of power and pride, of justice and ambition, would live on in story and stone. The Peloponnesian War did not destroy Greece, but it revealed its fragility and the cost of forgetting what once bound its people together. Chapter 12. The Philosopher and the Trial. In the hush that followed war, Athens did not return to its former self. The marble still shone, and the agora still stirred with voices, but the soul of the city had shifted. Glory had turned inward. What once soared now questioned itself, and in the midst of this uncertainty walked a man with no title, no wealth, and no writings, yet whose presence shook the very pillars of Athenian pride. His name was Socrates. He had no formal school. He carried no scrolls. What he carried, instead, was a method, quiet, probing, relentless. He would stand in the marketplace, near the stonemasons or the sandal makers, and simply ask questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is the good life? He never gave answers. He made others think. This made him dangerous. To some, Socrates was a teacher of wisdom. To others, a nuisance, a gadfly, as he would later call himself, stinging the slow-moving horse of Athens to keep it awake. He questioned respected poets, priests, generals, and politicians. He made the clever look foolish. He made the powerful feel small. And he did it not with cruelty, but with calm, a smile, a shrug, a gentle, piercing question that refused to go away. He was strange in other ways too. He walked barefoot through the seasons. He drank but was never drunk. He claimed a divine inner voice guided him, a daemon that whispered warnings, not commands. He served in the military, fought bravely, yet never sought honor. He lived simply, took no fees, and taught anyone who would listen, rich or poor, slave or free. But in post-war Athens, such a figure was unsettling. He stood as a mirror to the city's contradictions, and in time, that mirror would be shattered. City in crisis. Athens, after the Peloponnesian War, was a city filled with bruises it could not name. Once proud and radiant, it now stumbled in the aftermath. Its fleet was broken, its empire gone. Its dreams, once wrapped in democracy and reason, had withered into confusion. The plague had taken lives. The war had taken faith. Athens no longer knew who it was. In this atmosphere of tension, the search for blame began. Socrates, though never a politician, was tangled in the web of suspicion. Some of his former students, like Alcibiades and Critias, had betrayed the city. Alcibiades had switched allegiances during the war. Critias had become one of the brutal 30 tyrants who briefly ruled Athens after its defeat. Though Socrates himself had no part in their actions, his connection to them raised eyebrows. To the common people, tired of loss and fear, Socrates seemed part of the problem. His questioning felt like tearing down when the city needed building up. His refusal to flatter, to conform, to play the game, all of it fed a growing unease. And so, in 399 BCE, the charges came. Corrupting the youth, disrespecting the gods, introducing new spiritual beings. These were the accusations, vague yet powerful. Beneath them lay the deeper fear that Socrates was pulling apart the threads of tradition in a time when Athens desperately needed them whole. He would be given a trial. Fair by the standards of the time, a jury of hundreds would listen. But the outcome, some say, was already written in the city's pain. The trial of the mind. The court was not grand. There were no robes, no gavels, just citizens gathered, listening, and Socrates stood before them, old, calm, unshaken. He did not beg, he did not flatter, he did not plead for mercy. Instead, he used the platform as he always had, to teach. He questioned the meaning of piety. He challenged the idea of wisdom. He reminded the jury that he had never claimed to be wise, only that he knew he was not. He spoke of his daemon, his divine sign that had never warned him against his path. He declared that his actions, his life of questioning, were a duty given by the gods. To stop questioning, he said, would be to stop living rightly. To cease examining life would be to betray what made it meaningful. And if the city silenced him, it would only harm itself. The jury listened. Then it voted. By a narrow margin, they found him guilty. He was given a choice: propose a punishment. He could have suggested exile, a fine, silence. But Socrates, ever true to himself, suggested something else: that he should be rewarded with free meals in the Prytaneum, the Hall of Heroes. He was mocking, or perhaps simply honest. He saw no crime in what he had done. The jury voted again. This time, by a wider margin, they sentenced him to death. He accepted it. No cries, no fear, no escape, though his friends offered it. In his final days, he spoke to his followers about the soul, about death, about the immortality of wisdom. When the day came, he drank the poison, hemlock, with quiet hands. His last words, it is said, were a reminder to repay a small debt, a simple earthly concern as he crossed into mystery. He had been condemned by the state, but in dying as he lived, with courage and truth, he became immortal. Legacy through students. The silence that followed Socrates' death was not empty. It echoed through the minds of those he left behind. Chief among them was Plato, a young follower shaped deeply by the loss of his teacher. Plato took Socrates' words, remembered from countless conversations, and began to write. In dialogues, he preserved his voice, his questions, his challenges. Socrates lived again on the page, not as a martyr, but as a living spark. Plato did more than remember. He built something new, a school, the academy, just outside Athens. It became a place of study, of reflection, of questions asked not for power, but for understanding. It welcomed those who sought truth, not applause. And from it came ideas that would ripple through the centuries. From Plato came Aristotle, whose mind would shape logic, science, ethics, and more. And from those roots, the tree of Western thought began to grow. Through Rome, through the Renaissance, through every age that sought to understand itself. Socrates had never written a word, but through his students, he became a foundation. His trial, once a stain, became a lesson. His death, once a loss, became a story. A reminder that truth has a cost, but also a power that cannot be buried. Chapter 13. Macedonia rises. In the north, beyond the sacred temples of Athens and the disciplined lands of Sparta, lay a country few in Greece took seriously: Macedonia. To the southern Greeks, it seemed a rough and shadowed place, closer to the wild lands of Thrace than to the polished marble of the Aegean cities. Its people spoke a dialect that sounded strange to refined ears. They wore cloaks of wool instead of robes of silk, rode horses instead of debating in marketplaces, and drank heavily at long feasts rather than reciting poetry by the hearth. Macedonia was seen as half barbarian, half Greek, a place of strong arms and simple minds. But appearances, as history so often proves, are rarely the whole truth. For though the world looked south to Athens, where philosophers and sculptors made beauty from stone and speech, something else stirred to the north, something colder, harder, and no less powerful. In the valleys and mountains of Macedonia, the seeds of a new order were being sown. These people may have been seen as uncultured, but they were proud of their lineage, tracing their roots to Heracles, the hero of old. They worshipped the same gods, honored the same myths, and watched the same stars. And though they lacked the sophistication of city-states like Corinth or Delphi, they possessed something those splintered polis no longer had: unity of purpose. This unity would be forged into strength, and from this strength would rise a storm: Philip II's master plan. At the heart of Macedonia's rise stood a single man, Philip II. Before he was king, he was a hostage in Thebes. There, in the halls of one of Greece's most powerful cities, he observed. He watched their generals train. He listened to their counsels. He studied their weaknesses and their pride. When he returned to Macedonia, it was not as a prisoner, but as a visionary. Philip came to power in a time of crisis. The kingdom was torn by tribal feuds, surrounded by enemies, and weakened by years of instability. But where others saw chaos, Philip saw opportunity. He moved quickly and decisively, silencing rivals and centralizing power. Then, he turned to the army. He reformed it from the ground up. He lengthened spears into sarissas, long, bristling weapons that gave Macedonian phalanxes unmatched reach. He drilled his soldiers with discipline and precision, making them a force unlike any Greece had seen. He added cavalry, siege machines, and tactics borrowed from every corner of the Greek world. What emerged was not just an army, it was a machine of war and statecraft, sharpened for conquest. But Philip's brilliance was not only in battle. He was a master of diplomacy and deception. He married strategically, forging alliances through blood. He promised peace, then took territory. He offered support, then demanded loyalty. City by city, tribe by tribe, he expanded Macedonia's influence, not by brute force alone, but by outthinking and outmaneuvering his enemies. He presented himself as a friend of Greece, a protector of its traditions. But underneath, he was building something far more ambitious. He dreamed of uniting all of Greece under a single banner, not for its own sake, but as a springboard for something greater. His eyes were already turning east, toward the old enemy, Persia, the sacred war, and seized opportunity. While Philip gathered power, the southern Greek world continued to stumble. Athens, Thebes, and their allies were caught in another conflict, the Sacred War. This war, like so many in Greek history, began with religion, but became something more. City fought city. Allies turned on each other. Pride, politics, and fear swirled like storm winds across the land. To Philip, it was the perfect moment. He stepped into the chaos, not as a conqueror, but as a mediator. He offered support to Delphi, the sacred heart of Greece, claiming to defend its sanctity. He sent troops, then demanded influence. He took control of key routes and towns, then presented his presence as stability. When he won battles, he offered peace, but always on his terms. By the time the fighting ended, Philip was no longer just a northern king. He had a seat in the Amphictyonic Council, the body that governed Delphi. He had allies in Thebes, influence in Thessaly, and fear in Athens. And with his victories, he gained not only land, but legitimacy. He became the one leader who could speak for Greece, or at least enough of it to act. When he called for a congress to unite the Greek cities, many had no choice but to join. He framed it as a league, a partnership, but everyone knew who stood at its head. The League of Corinth was born, and with it, the old dream of pan-Hellenic unity returned, but under Macedonian rule. Philip declared that together, Greece would march east. Persia, the ancient enemy, would fall. It was the boldest dream since the Age of Heroes, and it was nearly within his grasp. assassination, and the inheritance of fire. Then, in a moment, it ended. In the year 336 BCE, at the wedding of his daughter in the city of Aegae, Philip was struck down. The assassin, one of his own bodyguards, ran but was caught and killed. The reasons were never fully known. Some said it was personal, others whispered of conspiracy, perhaps even from within Philip's own house. But the king was dead, and all eyes turned to his son, Alexander. He was just 20 years old, but already he had shown flashes of brilliance. Taught by Aristotle, forged in battle, he had grown up in the storm of power. He had led cavalry at Chaeronea. He had debated philosophy in the palace halls. He had watched his father unify a kingdom and outwit a continent. Now, the future rested on his shoulders. There was danger, of course, rivals, rebellions, doubts. But Alexander moved with the speed of thunder. He secured the throne, silenced his enemies, and renewed the oath of the League. And with the same fire that had burned in his father's eyes, he looked east. Philip had lit the flame. Alexander would carry it farther than anyone could imagine. In the quiet hills of Macedonia, where the wind whispered through pine and stone, the funeral fires of Philip rose. But from their smoke, a new vision began to take shape, not of a kingdom, but of an empire, not of division, but of destiny. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Greece held its breath. Chapter 14. The Boy Who Would Be God. In the stillness of the Macedonian hills, where olive trees bent gently in the breeze and stone paths wound between ancient oaks, a young boy once sat beneath the sun, listening not to the sound of swords, but to the voice of a philosopher. Alexander, son of King Philip II, was no ordinary prince, and the man guiding his mind was no ordinary tutor. His name was Aristotle, a thinker shaped by Plato, who believed that wisdom was as mighty as war. While other boys trained only with spear and shield, Alexander trained also with scroll and thought. In the cool shade of the royal garden, Aristotle opened the world before him. He spoke of logic and ethics, of nature and the stars, of the soul's purpose and the city's good, and Alexander listened. His eyes, sharp as flint, never wandered, for even as a child, he seemed to understand that knowledge was a kind of weapon, one that could shape nations without drawing blood. But these were not dry lessons. Aristotle made the world come alive. He taught Alexander of Achilles, the mighty warrior of myth, and whispered to him that greatness was not simply inherited. It was earned, step by step, through choices of both the sword and the spirit. From these teachings, Alexander learned not just how to rule, but how to think beyond borders. He came to believe that the world was not a map of kingdoms, but a living web of ideas, dreams and destinies waiting to be touched. As seasons passed, Alexander absorbed the legends of Heracles, the order of nature, and the movements of the heavens. He walked with reason in one hand and ambition in the other. And when he looked across the horizon, he did not see limits. He saw possibility. What began in books and breath would soon become the march of armies. The boy who studied in quiet shadows was becoming a man who would stride through history's brightest blaze. Battle of Gaugamela. The sun rose over the plains of Mesopotamia like a golden banner, unfurling across dust and silence. It was the year 331 BCE. The place was Gaugamela, and before Alexander stood a sea of warriors, the vast and glittering army of Persia, led by King Darius III. Numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with war chariots lined with blades and elephants armored for destruction. It was a force that should have shattered any hope of resistance. But Alexander did not come with numbers. He came with vision. His army was lean, 30,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 horsemen. But they were more than warriors. They were instruments in the hands of a master. And Alexander, just 25 years old, read the battlefield, not with fear, but with clarity. Where others saw chaos, he saw shape. Where others saw certain death, he saw narrow windows of destiny opening just wide enough to enter. As the two armies met, dust rose in columns, the roar of battle swelling like a storm. Darius struck with confidence, wave after wave of troops, pressing forward, his chariot spinning through the sand. But Alexander did not resist blindly. He waited, he watched, and then he moved. With precision, he created a gap in his own line, not a failure, but a trap. As the Persian forces surged forward, Alexander's elite cavalry swung like a blade, cutting into their flank. The battlefield twisted. Darius faltered. In a moment of pure daring, Alexander charged straight toward the Persian king. His spear pointed not at an army, but at a man. Darius fled, his command broken, his empire slipping from his grasp. What followed was more than victory, it was transformation. Persia, the great power of the East, had fallen not to size, but to strategy. Not to strength alone, but to the mind of a boy who had once listened to a philosopher beneath the trees. Gaugamela marked the turning of the world, and Alexander, dust-covered and unbowed, stood at its center. The march east. With Persia behind him, Alexander did not rest. His eyes turned further east, toward Egypt, Bactria, and the great rivers of India. He was not content with thrones or titles. What he sought could not be held in a crown. It was something deeper, a kind of unity, a blending of peoples and paths, a world stitched together by vision rather than fear. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator. There, along the Nile, he founded Alexandria, a city that would become a beacon of learning and light for centuries. Its walls were not yet raised, but its promise was already clear. It would be a place where Greek and Egyptian, thinker and builder, could walk the same streets and look toward the same stars. Then came the mountains of Afghanistan, the fierce resistance of the Sogdians, the silent weight of deserts that seemed to go on forever. Alexander pressed forward, always forward. He married Roxana, a local princess, and urged his generals to do the same, to mix blood and culture, to blur the lines between East and West. In India, he faced elephants, creatures he had never seen in war, and armies led by King Porus, a man of great strength and pride. The battle at the Hydaspes River was brutal. The rains fell heavy. The mud clung to horses' hooves. But Alexander adapted. He fought with patience, with care. And in the end, he won not just the battle, but Porus's respect. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." And Alexander, smiling, granted it. But as the edge of the world drew near, something changed. The men grew weary. Years had passed since they'd seen home. Their leader, once only a general, now spoke of gods and destiny. He wore Persian robes. He demanded divine honors. Some whispered, some turned back. Yet Alexander continued. He wept, it is said, not for what he had conquered, but for what remained unconquered. The ocean had stopped his march, but ambition still stirred in his chest. In the east, he saw not an end, but a mirror, a reflection of how far one life could reach when touched by both sword and spirit. The world he carved was not neat. It was not simple, but it was vast, and it bore his name in city after city, stone after stone. Death in Babylon. In the warm haze of Babylon, the city of gardens and gods, Alexander arrived as a man who had shaped the known world. He was 32. His body bore the marks of years at war, wounds that never fully healed, muscles that never rested. Yet his mind still burned bright. He dreamed of new campaigns, Arabia, Carthage, beyond. But fate had drawn its final line. One evening, after a feast, Alexander grew feverish. His breath became shallow, his limbs heavy. Some said he had been poisoned, betrayed by those who feared his rising divinity. Others believed it was malaria or the wounds that had never fully left him. Still others whispered that no man could live so fiercely, so fast without burning out like a star. For days he lay in silence. His generals stood by, waiting for a sign, but none came. When asked to whom he left his empire, it is said he replied only, "To the strongest." Then, like the fall of a flame, Alexander passed from this world. His body did not go home. It was placed in a golden sarcophagus, paraded through the streets, mourned by thousands. The empire he built, from Macedonia to the edge of India, did not survive him long. It split. It fractured. But his name remained. Some called him a god, others a tyrant. But all agreed he had changed history. He had walked the length of the earth not just as a conqueror, but as a man possessed by vision. In every stone of every city he built, a whisper lingers. The whisper of a boy who once studied beneath the trees, who dreamed not of peace nor of power, but of becoming something eternal. And though the dust has settled and kingdoms have crumbled, his story still breathes. In the hush of night, when the world is quiet, one can almost hear the hoofbeats fading into the east. Chapter 15. The Age of Hellenism. When Alexander fell, the world he had shaped trembled. His empire, once held together by vision and force, now cracked under the weight of ambition and uncertainty. No heir strong enough remained to claim the whole, and so his generals, the Diadochi, stepped forward, not as guardians of unity, but as rivals for a prize too large to share. These men had marched with Alexander across deserts and rivers. They had seen cities rise and kings fall, but now, without their leader, they turned against each other. The empire splintered like glass. Wars ignited, first cold with suspicion, then hot with swords. In every corner of the once unified realm, new kingdoms took shape. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, wrapping himself in the legacy of pharaohs while building his rule on Greek ideals. In the east, Seleucus took control of vast lands stretching from Mesopotamia to the borders of India. In Macedonia and Greece, Antigonus and his son Demetrius vied for power, always watching, always striking. And so the age of empire gave way to an age of kingdoms, smaller, fiercer, and forever chasing the ghost of Alexander's dream. But the wars were not simply about land, they were about memory. Who would carry forward the flame Alexander had lit? Who would wear his cloak of divine ambition? None could match his unity, yet each kingdom bore the echo of his rule. Statues of him were raised. Coins bore his image. His name still stirred awe in cities he had never touched. Across the shattered empire, the seeds of a new world began to grow. one not ruled by a single man, but by an idea. And though the Diadochi fought with fire and fear, they could not stop what Alexander had already begun. The borders had changed, but the tide of Hellenism, the spread of Greek culture, language, and thought, was just beginning to rise. Alexandria, city of light. At the mouth of the Nile, where the sea met the sands of Egypt, a city rose like a dream. Its name was Alexandria, named for the conqueror, but shaped by something even older, the human hunger for knowledge. Ptolemy, once Alexander's general, now pharaoh in all but name, chose this place as the jewel of his kingdom. But he did not just build walls and palaces. He built a beacon, not just of stone, but of mind. Alexandria became more than a city. It became a vision. Wide avenues stretched beneath colonnades. Markets rang with languages from across the world, and above it all stood two monuments that would shape the imagination of ages: the Lighthouse of Pharos and the Library of Alexandria. The lighthouse, tall as a mountain, watched over the harbor with fire and mirror, guiding ships through night and fog. But it was the library that held the true light. Within its walls, scribes and scholars gathered scrolls from every land, from Greece and Egypt, from Persia, India, even distant China. It was said that any ship that docked in the port had its text copied so that nothing would be lost. Here, the written word was sacred, knowledge was treasure, and thinkers from across the known world came to study beneath its roof. The city became a sanctuary for poets and scientists, philosophers and priests. Every question found a home in Alexandria. Every answer opened another door. What Ptolemy began, his successors expanded. They saw not just the value of empire, but the power of ideas. In Alexandria, the East met the West not in battle, but in conversation, and the result was something rare. A city where learning was law, and light came not only from the sun, but from the spark of understanding. Science and wonder. In the quiet rooms of Alexandria, where scrolls lined the walls and silence hummed. With thought, the minds of the age reached into the unknown. This was not a time of superstition alone, but of discovery. The ancient world, so often ruled by myth, now made space for measurement, for method, for marvels grounded in thought. Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, once stood beneath the Egyptian sun and noticed something strange. In Siena, a city to the south, a well cast no shadow on a certain day. Yet in Alexandria, the shadows stretched. From this, with only a stick, a well, and the angle of light, he measured the Earth's circumference. His answer was nearly perfect, and it came not from conquest, but from careful thinking. Then there was Archimedes, living in Syracuse, but part of the same great wave. He peered into the nature of levers and pulleys, imagined floating bodies and their weight in water. "Give me a place to stand," he once wrote, "and I will move the earth." He played with infinity, slicing shapes into smaller and smaller parts, chasing the edge of understanding. Doctors, too, studied the body with new eyes. Herophilos in Alexandria dared to dissect, to learn the flow of blood and the paths of nerves. He saw the brain not as a mystery, but as the seat of thought, and though his tools were simple, his questions were vast. This was not science as we know it today, but it was its early breath. It was curiosity, daring to ask why and how, in a world that had long been content with because. These thinkers did not reject wonder. They chased it more clearly. They believed the universe had order, and that order could, be known. The heavens moved with rhythm. The earth had shape. The human body, the stars above, the grains of sand, all were waiting to be understood. And so the legacy of Hellenism was not only in cities or kings, but in minds opened wide, in scrolls unrolled slowly, in thoughts whispered late into the night under lamplight, chasing truth. Cultural fusion. As the years passed, the world born of Alexander's conquest became something new. Not Greek, not Persian, not Egyptian, but something between and beyond. Cultures once kept apart by oceans, mountains, and pride now began to blend. The age of Hellenism was not just an era of war or science. It was an age of connection. Greek statues began to wear robes in the Eastern style. Gods once worshipped on separate altars now stood side by side. Zeus mingled with Ammon. Isis was spoken of in Athens. The stories of one people found echoes in the stories of another. Rituals changed, language shifted. In cities from Pergamon to Bactria, people heard Greek spoken in markets and Persian in courts. The world was not uniform, but it was layered. Art bore this fusion most clearly. Sculptures still celebrated the human form, but now with softer curves, deeper emotion. You could see the East in the eyes of a statue, feel its warmth in the folds of a robe. Temples rose with columns and domes. Mosaics told tales once foreign. Even the coins carried this mix. Greek letters around Persian kings, Egyptian gods beside Macedonian helmets. Philosophy too traveled. Stoics taught in Syrian courts. Epicureans debated in Egyptian gardens. Ideas moved faster than armies, spreading not by force, but by curiosity. And beneath it all was a new kind of identity, not rooted only in birthplace, but in shared stories, shared gods, shared dreams. This was the age when the world began to feel round, not in shape, but in spirit. The borders drawn by earlier generations began to blur. What was once foreign became familiar. A Greek child in Antioch might learn Sanskrit words. A trader in Babylon might sing a hymn from Thebes. The walls of difference, though not erased, became doors instead. And in this blending, this quiet daily fusion, the legacy of Alexander lived on. Not in empire, but in encounter. Not in conquest, but in curiosity. His dream, once wrapped in armor and ambition, had transformed into something gentler, a world where East and West no longer stood as strangers, but sat together at the same table, speaking in many tongues and listening. Chapter 16. Greece under Rome. In the quiet unfolding of time, the tides of power shift like the sea, sometimes slowly, sometimes in sudden storms. For Greece, the shift came not all at once, but in waves. The land that once taught the world, in poetry, in politics, in philosophy, now found itself looking westward toward a rising shadow. That shadow was Rome. Rome admired Greece. Its leaders quoted Greek words and walked in Greek fashion. But admiration did not stop ambition. As Rome grew from a republic to a force that stretched across seas, its eyes fell upon Greece, first with curiosity, then with hunger. What began as alliance became rivalry. What started with embassies ended with armies. The conquest of Greece was not a single moment, it was a slow breath, drawn over a century. Rome's first touch was diplomatic, helping Greeks fight their own internal wars, siding with one city-state against another. But as years passed, the Romans stayed. Each treaty brought Roman soldiers closer, each alliance bound tighter than the last. By the 2nd century BCE, Greece was no longer master of its own fate. Rome had become its protector in name and its ruler in truth. The Greek world, once rich with independence and pride, was now watched by Roman governors, patrolled by Roman troops. It was a subtle kind of takeover, not with fire at first, but with contracts and commands. And yet something quiet endured. Even as Roman boots pressed into Greek soil, even as orders came in Latin, the soul of Greece was not silenced. In lecture halls and libraries, on parchment and stone, Greek thought continued to whisper, ancient, wise, and waiting to outlast its conquerors. The fall of Corinth. Among the many cities that marked the glory of ancient Greece, Corinth stood proud. It was a place of wealth and culture, where ships from distant ports brought goods and stories. Its temples rose high, its markets were full, and its people held fast to the spirit of the old ways. But in 146 BCE, the pride of Corinth became its undoing. Rome had grown tired of rebellion. The Achaean League, a coalition of Greek cities including Corinth, had risen to challenge Roman control. They believed, perhaps naively, that the soul of Greece could still resist. But Rome no longer played the patient guardian. It now moved with power, swift and final. The legions marched. The siege began. Corinth, though brave, could not withstand what came. Flames climbed its walls. Statues toppled. Homes turned to ash. It is said the streets ran red and the treasures of the city were carried away, not as spoils alone, but as symbols of dominance. But even as Rome crushed Corinth, it paused in strange reverence. The destruction was real, brutal, and clear. Yet the generals, as they moved among the ruins, spoke not with scorn, but with sorrow. They knew what Corinth had been, a jewel of knowledge and art. And though they tore down its walls, they did not forget its wisdom. The fall of Corinth marked the end of Greek independence. From that moment on, Greece was no longer free. But in the very act of conquest, Rome revealed something deeper. It had not come to erase Greece, but to wear its robes. What followed was not silence, but a strange transformation. Greek cities, rebuilt, slower, smaller, but still breathing. And while the empire had shifted west, the spirit of the East would now flow through Roman veins. Greek minds in Roman homes. As Rome took Greece's land, it also opened its doors to Greece's soul. What could not be beaten in war began to shape the heart of the victors. In marble halls and candlelit studies, Roman nobles turned to the teachings of the very people they had conquered. In this new world, Greek thought became Roman treasure. Wealthy, Roman families hired Greek tutors for their sons. Children grew up not just speaking Latin, but quoting Homer and reciting Aristotle. The heroes of Greek myth were no longer distant. They lived again in Roman poems, plays, and paintings. In every statue carved, in every garden planned, the old forms of Greece returned. The philosopher's robe now hung in Roman closets. Plato's dialogues were copied by Roman scribes. Cicero, one of Rome's greatest orators, praised Greek reason and styled his thoughts in its rhythm. To be Roman was now, in part, to think like a Greek. Temples rose in Roman cities, not just for Jupiter and Mars, but for Apollo, Athena, and Dionysus. The gods, once housed only on Mount Olympus, now walked the cobbled streets of Rome in new names but familiar forms. Even in law and government, Greece left fingerprints. The Roman Senate debated in halls that echoed with Greek logic. Justice, as Rome defined it, carried the breath of Socratic questioning. Where once there had been legions and swords, there were now lectures and scrolls. This was not theft, it was transformation. The conquerors had become students, and in every corner of the empire, Greek brilliance flickered like a lantern passed from hand to hand. Though Greece no longer ruled in strength, it ruled in mind. The world had changed, but its guiding star still bore the shape of Socrates' questions and Sophocles' tragedies. In Roman homes, behind Roman walls, the ancient Greek spirit lived on, quiet, powerful, and enduring. Athens as a memory. In the days of empire, when Rome stood at its height, there remained one city, quiet, smaller than before, but sacred. That city was Athens. Athens had once lit the world. Its thinkers had dared to ask what truth was. Its artists had carved stone into life. Its people had invented democracy, flawed but bold. Now, its power was gone. No armies marched from its gates. No fleets sailed from its harbors. But its name still carried the weight of ages. Travelers came not to conquer Athens, but to remember it. Students walked its stone paths, reading aloud the words of Plato. Pilgrims stood before the ruins of the Parthenon, not in worship of gods, but in awe of history. The city had become a monument, not of war, but of wisdom. Rome protected Athens, more as a shrine than a city. Emperors donated to its schools. Statues were repaired. Philosophers were funded. The academy still taught. The lyceum still whispered, with thought. Time moved forward, but in Athens, the past was never far. It became a place where young minds went to feel old truths, to sit where Socrates had once stood, to see the hills that had inspired poets, to hear the wind that once carried debates into the night. Athens, though no longer powerful, became something more enduring, a memory made real, a place where the best of Greece still breathed, not in armies or empires, but in the soft turning of pages, in the hush of reflection, in the quiet light of learning. And as Rome marched forward into history, it did so with Athens in its heart, a city conquered, but never truly owned, a city that had given the world something too vast to fall, the power of an idea. Chapter 17. What the Greeks left behind. Long after the marble temples crumbled and the voices of orators fell silent, something of Greece remained, not carved in stone, but carried in thought. In the shaded walks of Athens and the busy marketplaces of old city-states, a quiet revolution had taken place. It did not come with spears or sails, but with questions, simple, profound, and eternal. Socrates walked barefoot through the streets of Athens, asking what it meant to be good, to be just, to live well. He left behind no writings, only the ripple of his method, a way of seeking truth by peeling back assumptions, one question at a time. His student Plato wrote dialogues that turned those questions into mirrors, reflecting the tension between the world we see and the world we imagine. And from Plato came Aristotle, who shaped logic, science, ethics, and the very language of learning itself. Greek philosophy did not seek easy answers. It asked how we should live, how we should govern, what it meant to know anything at all. These questions did not vanish when Rome conquered Greece. Instead, they spread, passed from hand to hand, through parchment and memory. Later, in medieval monasteries and Islamic libraries, scholars studied these ancient thoughts. In the Renaissance, they returned with new light. Even today, the echo of those thinkers lingers. When we speak of virtue, of freedom, of truth, We are walking a path first lit in Athens. The Greeks gave the world no final answers, but they gave us the tools to search, to doubt, to wonder. In doing so, they shaped not just what we think, but how we think. A legacy of mind that endures, quiet and unshaken. Democracy's seed. In a time when kings ruled by birth and empires rose by force, one city dared to try something different. Athens, though small, lit a spark that would one day grow into a flame seen across continents. They called it democratia, rule by the people. It was imperfect, it was exclusive, but it was new. Citizens, free, land-owning men, gathered, not to obey a king, but to vote, to speak, to share power. They stood in open spaces and shaped law with words instead of swords. It was messy, it was loud, it was in many ways fragile, but it offered a glimpse of something rare, a society built not on command, but on consent. This model faded in time. Athens fell, and with it, its experiment in self-rule. But the idea, the seed, was buried deep. Centuries passed. Empires came and went. And then, in faraway lands, new voices rose. In France, in America, in places yet unborn, thinkers looked backward to look forward. They studied the Athenian assembly, the power of the vote, the balance of debate, and they began again. Greece did not invent freedom for all. It did not build perfect justice, but it asked the question, what if the people ruled? That question, carried through ages, became a compass. It led generations toward governments not of one, but of many, toward laws shaped by discussion, not decree. Today, in the chambers of modern parliaments, in the ink of constitutions, in the chants of peaceful protests, the spirit of Athens whispers still. It reminds us that democracy is not a gift, but a task, never finished, always fragile, always worth tending, art that breathes. Walk through a museum, any museum, and pause before a statue from ancient Greece. The marble stands cold, yet somehow alive. A figure, perhaps a god, perhaps a hero, frozen in stillness, yet ready to move. Muscles curve softly beneath skin. Eyes, though blind, hold weight. Fingers carved from stone seem to remember, touch. This was the genius of Greek sculpture. It captured not just form, but feeling. Artists of the classical age studied the body not to copy it, but to understand it, to tell its story in silence. They carved from memory, from observation, from wonder. Each line was placed with care. Each fold of cloth, each tilt of the head carried meaning. Earlier art had been rigid, symbolic, distant, but the Greeks brought the human form closer. They showed it in motion, in stillness, in joy, in grief. The gods no longer floated above humanity. They stood among it. Divine, yes, but also familiar. Even architecture, the sweep of a column, the weight of a roof, reflected balance and beauty. The Parthenon did not rise in pride, but in harmony. Its angles were not just right, but pleasing. Its lines followed the quiet, mathematics of the human eye. Centuries later, artists in Rome, in Florence, in Paris, and beyond would look back. They studied these statues, these temples, these proportions. They borrowed, they built, they believed, and always they returned to the Greeks. What the Greeks gave was not just beauty, but a way of seeing, the belief that art could capture something eternal, that through clay and stone, one could reach toward the divine, not by escaping the human body, but by honoring it, and so their art breathes still. In cathedrals and campuses, in paintings and parks, it reminds us, quietly, that beauty is not only to be seen, but felt, and that even stone can speak, if shaped with love. A language of symbols. Even if we never read Homer, his words live in ours. Even if we never trace the lines of the Greek alphabet, its shapes ripple through the language we speak. The Greeks gave more than myths. They gave metaphors, symbols, sounds that still guide our stories and our science. The alphabet they shaped became a model, passed from Phoenician hands into Greek mouths, then onto Latin, and from there into nearly every Western script. When we write, we carry their forms. When we speak of Alpha and Omega, we echo their ancient prayers. Their myths, too, walk beside us. The tale of Icarus, soaring too high, falling too fast, has become a warning in every age. The story of Odysseus, wandering, clever, lost and longing, mirrors every journey home. The face of Medusa, the wrath of Zeus, the love of Orpheus. These are more than stories. They are mirrors of our fears, our hopes, our questions. In science, we use their terms. In math, their letters, pi, delta, sigma. Not just symbols, but bridges across centuries. Even the word philosophy, the love of wisdom, is theirs, and still ours. The Greeks gave us not just language, but a way of using it, to build meaning, to share feeling, to pass wisdom. They believed in the power of the spoken word, the written line, the tale well told. And so we write, we speak, we teach, in ways shaped, though we may not know it, by hands that lived long before us. A language of symbols that continues to unfold, not just in books, but in every moment. We search for meaning and name what we find. Chapter 18. The Echo of Marble. The wind moves softly through broken stone. In Delphi, in Athens, in Olympia, the air carries silence, and yet something deeper, an ancient breath, still exhaling. These were once cities of life and voice. Now they are quiet, but not forgotten, not lost. Under the stars, the ruins remain. Columns, cracked and leaning, still rise from the ground like the bones of a sleeping giant. Marble steps, worn by time and prayer, wait beneath dust and moonlight. The temples no longer call the faithful. The stadiums no longer roar with crowds. Yet something lingers. In the hush of night, when no tour guide speaks and no camera clicks, the stones whisper. Delphi, once the center of the world, where Apollo's voice echoed from the cave, now lies in careful fragments. But its message, of mystery, of seeking, of listening, still hums in the earth. The theater there looks out over the valley, where the trees roll like green waves, and the air smells of pine and myth. One can sit alone on those ancient seats and feel not absence, but presence. Athens, too, carries this feeling. The Parthenon stands broken, but proud. Its columns rise toward the sky, not with power, but with peace. It is no longer the house of a goddess. It is the memory of balance, of rhythm, of a time when architecture mirrored the order of thought. It has watched empires rise and fall, wars burn and fade. Still, it stands. And in Olympia, where the games were once held in honor of Zeus, grass now grows between stone markers. The running track, worn and narrow, curves beneath the sun. No chariots race there, no crowds cheer. But if one closes their eyes, they may still hear the echo of footsteps, the spirit of striving, the joy of movement, the thrill of play in a world that believed the body could honor the divine. The cities are no longer cities. They are memories, but they are not empty. They hold stories too wide for time. They remind us that greatness fades, but meaning stays. That even broken stone can teach if we walk slowly and listen. The flame of curiosity. If there was one fire that never went out in ancient Greece, it was the fire of asking. It burned not in temples, but in minds. It asked not for gold, but for truth. It was the flame of curiosity, and it still burns. Greece was never perfect. It fought itself. It stumbled. It often forgot its own ideals. But even through these flaws, it did one thing that changed everything. It questioned. It asked why the stars moved the way they did. It asked what justice meant. It asked what it meant to live, to love, to think. It believed that asking was not weakness, but strength. This hunger to know gave birth to something rare. It birthed the philosopher's path. It carved out spaces for debate, for thought, for wonder. It did not demand final answers. It allowed room for doubt, for reflection, for change. The Greeks looked at the world and did not stop at what they saw. They looked deeper. Why does the sun rise? What is a soul? Can a person be truly free? These were not questions of kings or priests alone. They belonged to anyone who could think, anyone who could speak. In this way, knowledge was shared like bread. Even their myths held questions. What happens when pride grows too tall? When power goes unchecked? When mortals reach for things meant for gods? These stories were not just tales, they were teachings in disguise. And through science too, this flame burned. Men like Thales, who sought water as the root of all things. Anaximander, who imagined the earth floating in space. Pythagoras, who saw number in everything. Their ideas were early and sometimes wrong, but they asked, they tried, they began. This is what made Greece great. Not armies, not wealth, but wonder. A restless, beautiful refusal to be content with the surface. A courage to dig deeper, even into the unknown. And that flame, once lit, has never gone out. It flickers in classrooms, in laboratories, in notebooks left open in the middle of the night. It lives in every child who looks at the stars and asks, what's out there? In every artist who wonders, what if? In every soul who still believes that the question matters more than the answer. The eternal agora. The agora, once just a space of stone and sun, was the true heart of Greek life. It was not a palace. It was not a temple. It was a public square. And in that openness, something eternal began. It was a place where ideas walked without fear, where traders set down goods and philosophers set down thoughts, where a farmer could speak beside a poet, where laughter rang beside argument, where life in all its forms gathered. This, more than any statue, is what Greece gave to the world: the courage to gather, to speak, to share, the belief that public space matters, that debate matters, that no single voice holds the whole truth. In that open square, democracy took shape, not as a perfect system, but as a living experiment. It asked, what if we decide together? And though flawed, it was bold. Today, the agora lives on, not in stone, but in spirit. It lives in parliaments where voices clash, and in classrooms where hands are raised. It lives in street corners, where strangers debate, and in digital forums where ideas move like wind. Every courtroom, every council hall, every protest march and coffee shop conversation. These are agoras, places where people meet not as rulers and ruled, but as citizens, as humans with thoughts, with hopes, with the need to be heard. Greece did not give us peace. It gave us the space to argue, and in that argument, to grow. The agora never needed walls. It only needed the will to come together, and so it lives. In the noise of cities, in the silence before someone speaks, in the pause between I believe and I wonder. A sacred space, reborn every time we choose to listen. Greece, in us. What Greece left behind cannot be measured in miles or in years. It cannot be boxed in a museum or stored in a book. It is quieter than that, deeper. Greece remains in how we think, how we hope, how we begin again. It is in the words we use: philosophy, democracy, theatre, history. Words born from old mouths, still shaping new lives. It is in our buildings, columns rising in courthouses and museums, echoes of temples now housing ideas instead of idols. It is in our myths, not just as stories, but as mirrors. We still wrestle with Icarus's fall, with Prometheus's fire, with Achilles' rage. These are not ancient problems, they are ours. It is in the rhythm of thought, in every student who doubts the textbook, in every artist who breaks the rule, in every person who walks alone, thinking not of answers, but of questions. Greece lives not in its past, but in our present. It is the courage to speak, the grace to listen, the wisdom to wonder. It is the belief that truth is not fixed, but found together. And it is, perhaps above all, the reminder that we are part of a long, unfinished story. A story that began in sunlit courtyards beneath olive trees, with a few people daring to say, "Let's think about this." So even as the temples fall and the marble fades, Greece does not end. It endures in us, in the light behind our eyes, in the step we take toward the future, in the echo of marble, still ringing softly through time.